A police dog saved its handler's life. What happened after made headlines worldwide. The freezing rain sliced through the night as Officer Dan Grayson maneuvered his patrol car down a desolate stretch of highway. His partner, Ace, a well-trained German shepherd with sharp amber eyes and a muscular frame, sat alert in the passenger seat, his ears twitching at every sound. The storm had turned the quiet city outskirts into a chaotic mess of slick roads and poor visibility. But for Dan and Ace, it was just another night on the job. Before we continue with the video and dive deeper into the incredible story, I want to ask for your help. I'm aiming to reach 1,000 subscribers, and your support would mean the world to me. If you've been enjoying this content, please hit that subscribe button and join our growing community. And let me know where you're watching from in the comments down below. Dan had been with the K9 unit for 5 years. But Ace was different from any dog he'd worked with before. Their bond went beyond the professional. When Dan's wife passed away 2 years ago, Ace became his rock, providing silent but unwavering companionship. "Just another night for us, buddy," Dan said, glancing at Ace, who gave a soft bark, as if in agreement. They were responding to a call about a suspicious vehicle spotted near an abandoned warehouse, a known hotspot for illegal activity. The tension in the air was palpable. When they reached the location, the warehouse loomed like a shadowy fortress against the rain-slicked ground. Dan parked the car and switched off the headlights. He adjusted his vest and radioed in their position before opening the door. Ace leapt out, his movements precise and calculated. His nose was already working the air, scanning for scents of danger. Together, they approached the warehouse, their boots and paws crunching against the gravel. The eerie silence was shattered by a faint noise from inside, a muffled clatter of metal. Dan signaled for Ace to stay close, his heart pounding as adrenaline surged. He unholstered his flashlight and weapon, stepping cautiously into the darkness. The warehouse was a labyrinth of towering shelves, rusting machinery, and broken crates. Shadows danced wildly as Dan's flashlight beam swept across the space. Ace sniffed the ground, his tail stiff, signaling he had picked up a scent. Dan's grip on his weapon tightened. Suddenly, a sharp sound, a tin can being kicked, echoed from the far corner of the warehouse. Ace froze, his body coiled like a spring. Dan gave the silent command to investigate, and Ace darted forward with practiced stealth. Dan followed closely, his senses on high alert. As they rounded a stack of crates, Ace barked furiously, his deep, commanding voice reverberating through the cavernous space. In the beam of Dan's flashlight, 2 figures came into view, their faces masked. One held a crowbar while the other clutched a bag filled with stolen electronics. "Police! Hands where I can see them!" Dan shouted, his voice firm and unwavering. The man with the crowbar dropped the bag and bolted toward a side exit, while the other froze, his hands raised. Ace didn't hesitate. He tore after the fleeing suspect, his powerful legs propelling him forward. Dan restrained the remaining man, quickly securing him with handcuffs before calling for backup. The sound of Ace's pursuit echoed in Dan's ears. "Good boy, Ace," he murmured, his confidence in his partner unshaken. But then a deafening crash resounded from the direction Ace had gone. Dan's blood ran cold. "Ace!" he called. Sprinting toward the noise, he pushed through a broken door, his flashlight slicing through the rain that now poured through a partially collapsed roof. In the chaos, he spotted Ace standing protectively over the suspect, who lay sprawled on the ground with a twisted ankle. But something was wrong. Ace barked urgently, his eyes fixed on the scaffolding above. Dan followed his gaze and realized with horror that the entire structure was about to collapse. The suspect moaned, clutching his leg, unable to move. Without hesitation, Dan rushed to grab the suspect, but Ace acted faster. The dog grabbed the man's jacket in his teeth, dragging him toward safety as debris rained down around them. Dan dove after them, shielding both Ace and the suspect as the scaffolding crashed to the ground, sending a plume of dust and debris into the air. When the dust settled, Dan's heart was pounding in his ears. "Ace?" he croaked, coughing. The dog stood beside him, unharmed but clearly shaken, his intelligent eyes scanning Dan's face as if asking if he was okay. Dan pulled Ace into a rare embrace, whispering, "You saved us, buddy. You saved us all." The sound of sirens in the distance signaled the arrival of backup. As Dan caught his breath, he realized this was just the beginning of a story that would soon captivate the world. What Ace had done that night was more than heroic. It was extraordinary. The morning sun crept through the blinds of Officer Dan Grayson's modest home, illuminating the living room where Ace lay sprawled on a soft bed. The German shepherd's ears twitched as the faint hum of Dan's coffee maker signaled the start of a new day. Despite the adrenaline of the previous night, exhaustion still lingered in the air. Dan shuffled into the room, holding a steaming mug of coffee. His gaze softened as it landed on Ace, who was awake but resting, his amber eyes watching Dan intently. "Morning, partner," Dan said, setting his mug on the table and crouching beside Ace. He gently ran a hand over the dog's back, checking for any signs of injury from the warehouse collapse. Ace had walked away without a scratch, but Dan couldn't help worrying. "You're amazing, you know that?" Dan murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't think I've ever seen anyone, human or otherwise, act so fast. You saved my life last night." Ace responded with a soft woof, his tail thumping against the floor. Despite the gravity of the events, the bond between them was as unwavering as ever. Word of Ace's heroism spread quickly. By noon, the precinct was buzzing with activity. Officers and reporters filled the space, all eager to hear more about the K-9 who had not only apprehended a dangerous suspect, but also saved lives in the process. "Grayson!" Captain Morales called, waving him over. She was a no-nonsense leader with a keen sense of justice. But today, her stern demeanor was replaced by a rare smile. "You and Ace are the talk of the city. Reporters want to meet you both." Dan scratched the back of his neck, uncomfortable with the attention. "It wasn't just me. Ace deserves all the credit." Morales nodded. "He's a remarkable dog, but you're his handler, and that makes you a team. Go speak to them. It's good PR for the department, and frankly, it's a story people need to hear." With a reluctant sigh, Dan headed to the front of the precinct where a cluster of reporters stood, cameras and microphones poised. Ace trotted beside him, his confident demeanor masking the slight tilt of his head as he scanned the unfamiliar faces. "Officer Grayson, can you tell us about last night?" a reporter asked, her voice tinged with excitement. "How did Ace manage to act so quickly?" Dan cleared his throat, his hand resting on Ace's back for reassurance. "Ace has been my partner for 3 years, and he's always had incredible instincts. Last night, he did what he's trained to do, protect and serve, but honestly, it was more than that. He acted with courage and intelligence that goes beyond training." The cameras clicked furiously as Dan recounted the events, his words highlighting Ace's bravery. The reporters leaned in, captivated by the story of a dog who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to assess danger and act accordingly. "What's next for Ace?" another reporter asked. Dan chuckled, glancing down at his loyal companion. "Well, first a lot of treats. After that, he'll be back to work. He wouldn't want it any other way." The room erupted in laughter and applause, the mood lightening as Ace wagged his tail, his eyes darting between Dan and the reporters as if sensing he was the center of attention. Later that day, as the precinct quieted down, Dan received an unexpected call from a city official. The mayor wanted to recognize Ace's heroism with an official commendation, an honor rarely given to a K-9 officer. When Dan relayed the news to Captain Morales, she smiled broadly. "He deserves it, and so do you. Be there tomorrow. It'll be good for both of you." Dan returned home that evening, feeling a mix of pride and humility. As he settled onto the couch, Ace jumped up beside him, resting his head on Dan's lap. "You're going to be famous, you know that?" Dan said, scratching behind Ace's ears. The dog let out a contented sigh, his tail wagging gently. But beneath the pride, Dan couldn't shake the memory of the warehouse. He replayed the moment the scaffolding collapsed, the sound of debris crashing down, and the look in Ace's eyes as he sprang into action. It was as if Ace had known exactly what needed to be done, not just out of training, but out of an unshakable loyalty that transcended words. "You're not just a partner," Dan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're family." The following day, the city's park was transformed into a venue fit for heroes. A stage adorned with flags and a podium stood at the center, surrounded by rows of chairs filled with officers, families, and members of the community. Dan adjusted his tie nervously as he stood backstage with Ace. The German Shepherd was fitted with a new collar, its polished badge gleaming in the sunlight. "You ready for this, buddy?" Dan asked. Ace wagged his tail, his ears perking up as if to say, "Always." When their names were called, the crowd erupted into applause. Dan led Ace onto the stage, his heart swelling with pride. The mayor stepped forward, her voice echoing through the microphone as she recounted the events of that fateful night. In the face of danger, Officer Ace exemplified the qualities we hold dear: courage, loyalty, and selflessness, she said. "It is an honor to present him with the Medal of Valor, a symbol of our city's gratitude for his extraordinary bravery." The crowd rose to their feet, cheering as the medal was placed around Ace's neck. The dog stood tall, his tail wagging proudly as Dan knelt beside him, unable to hide the emotion in his eyes. "You deserve this, buddy," Dan whispered, his voice barely audible over the applause. As the ceremony concluded, Dan couldn't help but marvel at how much Ace had changed his life. Together, they had faced danger, saved lives, and forged a bond that no words could adequately capture. But little did Dan know, their journey was far from over, and the events that lay ahead would prove just how unbreakable their connection truly was. The days following the ceremony were a whirlwind of activity. Ace had become a local celebrity, his heroic act covered in newspapers, on TV, and even trending on social media. While Dan appreciated the recognition, he was eager to return to their routine, patrolling the streets, training, and spending quiet evenings together. Despite the newfound attention, Ace remained the same loyal, grounded partner. But Dan began to notice something unusual. Ace had always been alert, but now his attentiveness seemed heightened, almost as if he were anticipating something. He'd often sit by the door at night, ears pricked, occasionally letting out a low rumble of a growl. "What's up with you, buddy?" Dan asked one evening, as Ace stood rigid by the window, staring into the dark. The dog turned to him, his amber eyes filled with an intensity that sent a chill down Dan's spine. The next day, while on patrol, Ace's strange behavior continued. As they drove through a quiet neighborhood, Ace began to whine softly, his nose pressed against the window. Dan slowed the car, scanning the street for anything unusual, but everything seemed normal. "What is it?" Dan asked, pulling over. He opened the car door, and Ace leapt out, his nose to the ground as he began to track something. Dan followed closely, his heart pounding. He trusted Ace's instincts implicitly, but the urgency in the dog's movements was unlike anything he'd seen before. Ace led Dan through an alleyway, past a row of dumpsters, and into a vacant lot. The area was eerily quiet. The only sound, the crunch of Dan's boots on the gravel. Ace stopped abruptly, his ears swiveling as he sniffed the air. Then he let out a sharp bark, his body tense. Dan's hand instinctively went to his sidearm as he surveyed the lot. At first, he saw nothing, but then a faint noise reached his ears. A soft, muffled cry. It was coming from behind a pile of discarded pallets. "Ace, stay," Dan commanded, his voice steady but low. He approached cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. As he rounded the corner, his heart sank. There, tied to a post and partially obscured by debris, was a young woman. Her wrists were bound, and her face was pale, streaked with dirt and tears. She looked up as the light hit her, her eyes wide with fear and relief. "Help me," she whispered hoarsely. Dan sprang into action, calling for backup as he freed the woman. "You're safe now," he assured her, his voice calm, despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Ace stayed by his side, his body a shield as if guarding both Dan and the woman from any unseen threat. As officers arrived on the scene, the woman was taken to safety, her captors apprehended soon after. Dan learned that she had been abducted days earlier and hidden in the lot, her fate uncertain, if not for Ace's uncanny ability to sense her presence. The incident solidified Ace's reputation as a hero, but for Dan, it was a deeply personal reminder of their bond. He couldn't stop replaying the moment Ace had guided him to the lot, the way the dog's instincts had once again saved a life. That night, as they returned home, Dan knelt beside Ace, his hand resting on the dog's head. "You're incredible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how you do it, but I'm grateful every day that you're my partner." Ace licked Dan's face, his tail wagging as if to say, "We're in this together." Over the next few weeks, Dan and Ace's bond grew even stronger. They trained harder, spent more time together, and seemed to operate on an almost telepathic level. But their work wasn't done. The streets of their city were unpredictable, and danger was always lurking. One crisp autumn evening, Dan and Ace were called to a potential break-in at an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building was abandoned, its windows boarded up, and its interior cloaked in darkness. As they approached, Ace's ears perked up, and he let out a low growl. "Looks like we've got company," Dan muttered, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of mildew and rust. The floorboards creaked underfoot as Dan moved cautiously, Ace by his side. Suddenly, Ace stopped, his body rigid. He barked sharply, his gaze fixed on a shadowy figure near the far wall. "Police, show yourself!" Dan commanded, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. The figure bolted, disappearing into the darkness. Dan and Ace gave chase, weaving through the maze of crates and debris. Ace's nose was to the ground, his movements swift and purposeful. Within minutes, they cornered the suspect, who surrendered without a fight. As backup arrived to secure the scene, Dan couldn't help but marvel at Ace's instincts. Once again, his partner had proven indispensable. In the weeks that followed, Ace was awarded another commendation, this time for his role in rescuing the woman and apprehending the warehouse suspect. But for Dan, the true reward was the bond they shared, a partnership built on trust, loyalty, and an unspoken understanding. One evening, as they sat on the porch of Dan's home, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Dan looked over at Ace, who was stretched out beside him. "You've changed my life, you know that?" Dan said softly. "I thought I was the one looking out for you, but it turns out you're the one who keeps me safe." Ace lifted his head, his amber eyes meeting Dan's. In that moment, no words were needed. Their bond was unbreakable, their partnership a testament to the extraordinary connection between man and dog. And as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Dan knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Because Ace wasn't just a dog, he was a hero, a partner, and family.